Hey guys, tonight we begin with the soft breath of wind slipping through the thatched walls of a home that never had windows, just cloth, nailed tight to the cold. There's no grand entrance here. No sword on the table, no king in the hall. Just a wooden bowl still warm from a meal that wasn't quite enough. This is not the history they wrote down in ink and gold leaf. It's the kind you feel in your chest when the fire starts to fade and no one moves to feed it. The kind that huddles under scratchy wool and calls survival a quiet miracle. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video. And consider subscribing only if it feels right. Let me know where you're watching from. What time is it for you? We won't be chasing famous names tonight. No castles. No banners. Only the hush of people who lived behind those stories, unknown, unnamed, but never truly forgotten, because every chapter of this night will take you deeper into the unlit corners of medieval life, into the chill behind the barn, the soft crunch of old snow under barefoot children, the damp of a bed shared by three and warmed by none. These people didn't write the rules of history. They endured them, bent over chores in the cold, stirred thick pots with raw fingers, prayed in the silence, not for glory, but for a bit more wood, a longer loaf, a winter that passed quietly. You're not here to be amazed. You're here to feel something older than books. The ache in the joints, the soot in the lungs, the love. Hidden in the simplest acts, like pulling the blanket up over someone else before yourself. So, before we begin, take a slow breath and imagine the air inside that little home full of smoke, steam, breath, and hope. The door creaks gently. A candle sputters. And so, the story begins. The day didn't begin with light. It began with cold, before even the smallest crack of blue appeared along the thatch eaves. Someone was already awake, because sleep had slipped away quietly, nudged out by the slow seeping ache in the bones. It wasn't a harsh jolt, just the kind of discomfort that crept in gently, like mist over fields. First the toes, then the fingers, then the hollow between shoulder blades. A shiver not of fear, but of routine. The air inside the hut held its breath. You could hear the wood creak softly beneath wool-wrapped limbs. Somewhere across the room, another breath stirred. A shared body shifted beneath the covers. Not speaking, just surviving the last stretch of night. Clothes didn't hang ready on pegs. They were already on the body, worn while sleeping, stiff, with yesterday's work still damp from the fire's final hiss hours ago. There was no distinction between nightwear and daywear. There was just one layer less, one blanket more, and the faint hope that no one had kicked it off during a dream. The roof above wasn't solid. Cold slipped through reeds. Frost crept along beams. And yet, nothing felt broken. This was simply how mornings arrived in places where chimneys were still a novelty and comfort came second to entrance. A tea wasn't always about waking. Sometimes it was about not having slept at all. A mother might lie silently in the dark, counting the breaths of her child, listening for that cough that hadn't quite gone away. A boy might stare at the crack of the door, watching for the color to shift. A grandmother might hum softly beneath her breath, not a tune, just a sound to push back the quiet, and in that pause between night and duty, something fragile settled. Not peace, not warmth, but something close. A kind of understanding that you weren't alone in your discomfort. In the neighboring hut, someone else was stirring, not by clock or rooster, but by the ache in the knees that told them it was time to start the fire again. Before the children woke to frozen fingers, the straw mattress whispered as someone sat up. The first barefoot step met the dirt floor, cold as stone, gritty from the day before, slightly damp from the mist that always found its way in. That step mattered because that step said, "Yes, I will face it again." Outside, the world waited under a layer of frost that looked almost magical if you didn't have to walk through it barefoot. Smoke had not yet begun to rise from rooftops. No footsteps marked the path. The village was holding its breath. Inside, someone reached for yesterday's embers. Wrapped in cloth, hands shook slightly, not from fear, not even from chill, but from that thin place between sleep and alertness where the body hadn't yet caught up to the will. The fire was coaxed to life with dried bits of dung, a few brittle twigs, and whispered prayers that it would catch this time. No matches, no promise, just patience and breath and the faint glow of something fighting to live again. Sometimes the flame took its time. Sometimes it didn't come at all, but if it did, if it flickered just right, it would light the inside of the hut with a color softer than sunrise. It would paint the faces in gold and orange, bring shadows to life, and for a moment, make everything look sacred. It wouldn't last long, but it would be enough to bring someone else to life. A child might sigh in her sleep. A man might pull his legs back under the blanket. Someone might whisper, "It's catching." And in that moment, before the bread, before the chores, before the bitter chill of the wind, there was a kind of victory. You were still here. You had made it through another night. And that brings us to what came next when cold followed you into every bite and breath. Bread was not a luxury. It was an expectation, but expectations in the medieval world rarely aligned with ease. They were shaped by scarcity, stretched by hope, and dusted with the kind of compromise no recipe ever admitted. By the time the dough was ready, it had already absorbed more than flour smoke, sweat, silence. The morning fire, if it caught, wasn't for comfort. It was for food, or something like it. A small iron pot was nudged toward the coals, and beside it, a wooden bowl scraped. Thin from years of kneading waited for its usual burden. Flour didn't come in bags. It came in handfuls, bartered from a neighbor, owed from last harvest, swept from the corners of a dusty sack. It smelled of old wood and earth, and sometimes something slightly sour. It wasn't always wheat. Sometimes rye. Sometimes barley. Sometimes a mix of whatever could be crushed under stone and passed off as flour. Into it went water cold, not because it should be, but because there was no other kind, and a bit of salt if the house still had some. No yeast from a packet. Only a bit of yesterday's dough, pinched off and saved like treasure, folded in gently, still clinging to its memory of rising. And then the ashes came, not on purpose, but they were always there, when the fire smoked more than it burned, when the hearth crumbled at the edges, when soot danced in the air and fell like black snow onto everything, including the bowl. It couldn't be helped. Ashes in the dough, a bitter crunch in the middle of a bite, but the dough didn't complain, and neither did the people. Because complaining used energy, and energy was meant for stirring, for kneading, for pinching and folding and hoping it wouldn't fall apart before the stone was hot enough to hold it. The oven was not a place in the kitchen. It was a communal structure, sometimes an old flat stone, sometimes a fire pit, and sometimes just a spot outside the hut where the sun fell long and hot enough to warm a piece of slate. Sometimes you didn't even bake your own bread. You carried your shaped, slightly gritty dough to the baker's oven, your turn waiting behind neighbors, each loaf marked with a small notch or twist, so no one would mix them up. And in the time it took for years to bake, smoke curling lazily toward the sky, heat radiating from the fire like the last kindness of the season, you'd stand with others, not talking much, just watching, listening to the quiet pops of wood, holding your hands out, pretending it was enough. You could smell the crust before you saw it, that faint sweet burn of flour meeting flame. Not golden, not soft, just done, and if your loaf didn't break apart at the edges. If it hadn't taken on too much ash. If it rose, even a little then, it was a good day. A tea would be cut carefully. Never torn, never wasted. Each slice was a slice of something sacred, because it meant your hands had done enough to keep you fed, even if only for tonight. Some spread lard on top. Some dipped it into broth if there was broth to be had. Children might suck on the crust long after the rest was gone, just to stretch the flavor a little longer, and sometimes the loaf was hidden, wrapped in cloth, slipped under a pile of straw, tucked away not out of greed, but out of necessity. Because hunger didn't keep time. It came in the middle of the night. It came in whispers and stomach growls and dreams where bread was always just out of reach. So you saved a little, just in case, ashes and all, and while no one ever said it aloud, everyone knew. A loaf of bread that lasted the day was worth more than most words, because in a world where warmth fled with the wind and walls let in the cold, food stayed for a while. At least until the next dawn, when fingers would once again search for flour and mouths would chew slowly, carefully, as if tasting not just the bread but the effort it had taken to make it. And that effort, that quiet ritual, was never just about eating. It was about enduring, just like the fire, just like the blankets, just like the silence. And now that the belly is full, at least for now, let's return to where the body rests, even if rest itself was rarely peaceful. The floor didn't creak in protest. It groaned in quiet understanding. Beneath the bed, or what passed for one, was not mystery or monsters or hidden treasures. Just dirt. Sometimes straw. Sometimes old cloth or flattened reeds, browned with time, and pressed into the ground by countless footsteps and sleepless turns. The cold didn't live outside. It lived underfoot. It rose from the earth like a memory, ancient and indifferent. No matter how many layers you placed between your skin and the soil, it always found its way through. Through blankets. Through wool. Through worn-out shoes, if you still had them. Beds were never just for one. They weren't tucked in corners with space to stretch. They were squeezed in tightly, side by side, limb against limb. Body heat shared out of necessity, not affection. A child's heel in your ribs. An elder's breath behind your neck. A blanket tugged back and forth through the night, like a silent negotiation. The straw mattress, if there was one, did little to stop the cold. It crackled with every shift, itchy and uneven, a bed of thorns in disguise. And beneath that damp, earth, always slightly wet, always colder than it had been the day before. A reminder that the ground could take your heat, but rarely offered any back. A tea was no wonder people slept curled like question marks, bent into themselves, arms crossed over chests, legs tucked tight, trying to keep their warmth from escaping down through the mattress and into the waiting ground. Even the rats knew it was warmer above. They skittered across beams and under thatch, avoiding the icy bite that lived below. They knew the floor wasn't just the bottom of the room. It was the beginning of hunger, the starting place of frostbite, a slow thief that robbed people of comfort one breath at a time. In the deep dark of winter, people placed ashes beneath their beds, not to warm them, but to keep the damp from turning to ice. Cold ashes, spread thin, soft and gray, a humble shield. A line drawn between skin and soil. Sometimes they placed flat stones there too, heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth, carried across the room carefully, placed under the straw with hands that trembled not from age, but from knowing what it was like to lie down without it. Even then, it barely helped, but barely was enough. The children always found the warmest spots, nestled in the middle, between bodies, small enough to disappear under blankets. They breathed in the scent of wool, of smoke, of sleep. And they didn't know yet that the world beneath the bed was colder than any dream, but the parents knew. They woke early, not just to begin the day, but to stop the cold from settling too deep. If the fire was dead, they lit it. If the frost had crept in, they swept it out with stiff brooms made from twigs, and still the cold remained in the air. In the walls. Beneath every bed, sometimes when the weather turned cruel, families would abandon their own bedding and sleep in the barn. Not for comfort, but for the heat of livestock. Huddled beside cows or pigs, breathing in their warmth, the stink of manure forgiven in the name of survival, the hay that was thicker, the ground was warmer, and though it scratched and poked and clung to skin, it didn't steal heat like the earth did in those nights. When wind howled through every crack and hunger curled like a cat in the belly, it wasn't sleep they sought, it was preservation, a pause from the cold, a place where breath didn't turn to fog the moment it left your mouth. They didn't speak of this. No one said, "We are cold." They just lived it. They wrapped cloth tighter, sat closer, moved slower, and told stories in whispers, not to entertain, but to keep the silence from reminding them how thin the walls really were. And when morning came, and the children stirred, and someone reached down to the floor to grab a shoe, a pot, or a fallen blanket, they always winced. Not from pain. From the memory, the cold never left. It simply waited under the bed, beneath the straw, in the cracks of the stone, in the silence between two breaths. But warmth came in unexpected ways too, in a body pressed beside yours, in the heat of a single ember saved and coaxed to life, in the slow rhythm of survival passed down night after night. And that brings us to the next small battle, the one that came every morning, when the well froze solid and thirst joined the cold at the door. The sound of the well was different in winter. In summer, it echoed. The splash of the bucket was soft, almost musical, like a secret being dropped into the earth. But in winter, there was no splash, no echo, just silence, heavy, hollow, waiting. Some mornings, someone would go to the well before the sun had reached the rooftops, wrapped in a cloak that still held yesterday's chill. The rope would creak on the spindle, hands stinging against the cold wood. And then resistance, a thud. And no give. The bucket hit a wall of ice. That was when they knew the well had frozen again. It didn't matter if it was shallow or deep, stone-lined or wood-braced. If the night had been cruel enough, and it often was, the water below had turned to glass. Not the beautiful kind. The kind that trapped what you needed, just out of reach. There were no backup plans. There were no taps to turn, no plastic jugs in waiting. The well was it. Water for porridge, for dough, for animals, for faces and feet and cracked lips. And now it was locked. Some would try to break it, lower the bucket with a rock tied beneath to crack the surface. Others fetched long poles, tapping, nudging, praying for a fracture. But often it was just a waiting game. You waited for the sun. You waited for warmth. You waited for the ice to loosen its grip and release your day. While you waited, you rationed. Yesterday's water, if there was any, was brought near the fire. What little was left in pots or basins, now coated in a skin of ice so thin you could breathe it away, but still there. It was chipped, stirred, and used for the most pressing needs. Drinking was not the first priority. The animals needed theirs first, especially the few that gave milk. A cow that didn't drink would not feed. And without that, children went without. So the animals drank from chipped troughs, their tongues steaming in the cold, water sloshing thick and slow like oil. They drank gratefully, silently, not knowing how close the balance had come. Sometimes the water came not from the well, but from snow. Tea was gathered in baskets, scooped with hands that burned red from the cold. brought inside and left by the fire to melt. It took longer than you'd think. Snow was mostly air. A full basket yielded barely a bowlful, but it was something. There was a rhythm to melting snow, like a slow prayer. A reminder that even frozen things could become soft again, given enough time, enough heat, enough patience. Children often didn't understand why they couldn't play in it, why they couldn't waste it, because to them, it was a toy to there. Parents, it was survival. They whispered reminders. Don't eat it. Don't bring it inside with your boots. Don't waste what might keep us alive. There were superstitions too. Some believed that the well's freeze was a sign, that the earth was holding back because something was wrong, that a sick animal, a broken promise, a forgotten prayer had caused the cold to harden in punishment. Others just saw it as another thing that winter took, because winter always took. It took the color from the trees, the softness from the ground, the heat from the fire. And now, even the water. So they waited, and sometimes the sun came late, or not at all. And by the time the ice broke, the bucket had split, the rope had frayed, and the day had already begun its slow descent back into night. But when the well finally opened again, when the bucket lowered cleanly, and that splash echoed up from the deep, there was no celebration, just a quiet breath, a nod, a wordless thanks, and water clear, cold, honest was brought inside like a miracle. Steam rose from the pot, and with it, a kind of peace. Because for now, at least, thirst had been postponed until the next freeze, until the next hard silence, until the next morning, when someone would rise before the sun and lower the bucket. Again, unsure of what they'd find, because survival wasn't a triumph. It was a routine, and sometimes the greatest victories were invisible. Just a mouthful of water, just a well that gave instead of withheld, and just enough warmth to face the next small trial. Like wrapping your entire life in wool and hoping it would be enough. Warmth didn't come from fire alone. It came from thread, from fabric, from the scratchy, stubborn layers that clung to the body like a second skin. And no cloth was more faithful or more unforgiving than wool. It was not soft, not kind, not easy. It was thick, coarse, itched in the folds of the arms and neck, trapped smoke in its fibers and soaked up the damp like a sponge. But it stayed. And that meant everything. A tunic woven from rough spun wool could keep a body just dry enough, just warm enough, just alive enough to get through the kind of day that punished bare skin without mercy. In the medieval world, wool wasn't fashionable. Was survival stitched into every seam. Children were the handed-down remnants of older siblings. Each patch was a quiet history. This tear from the fence, this burn from the hearth, this fray from too many winters. Their sleeves hung long or short depending on the season, not the fit. Trousers were stiff with old mud, knees worn thin from prayer, play, or crawling into bed before the fire went out. Mothers race-stitched collars by candlelight. Fathers patched holes with bits of cord or leather, not because they had time, but because they had no choice. To own a cloak was to own a shield, not against swords, but against wind, against drizzle, against the creeping kind of cold that found its way into bones and stayed there. A good cloak was rarely washed. It smelled of smoke, of sweat, of earth. It grew heavy with weather, stained with seasons. And yet, when wrapped around shoulders at dawn, or pulled tight across a sleeping child's chest, it felt like protection. Real, immediate, and warm. People shared cloaks. Lovers. Siblings. Entire families, when one ventured out and the rest stayed in. Because wool cost more than coin, it cost labor. It began with sheep, not pets, not symbols. just small animals with dull eyes and dirty fleece. They grazed in wet fields and bleated when trimmed. Their wool was gathered once or twice a year, thick with lanolin and bits of hay. Not soft curls clumps, shearing was done by hand, with blades that dulled fast and nicked faster. It wasn't gentle. Not for the sheep, not for the shearer, and once off the animal, the work was only beginning. The wool had to be washed in cold streams, beaten, combed, dried on hedges, and spun by calloused fingers into thread. Then came the weaving on looms, built from wood in prayer, the kind that creaked louder than the wind. And then, the garment, maybe, if you had the means. Most did in single quotes t-dot as so they reused what they had dotted. An old sleeve became a child's mitten. A torn hem became a lining. A fraying shawl became stuffing for a pillow that barely softened the bed. You could tell how harsh the winter was by how many layers someone wore indoors. Some wore 4 tunics by January, others only 1, but walked in circles to keep the blood moving. Wool wrapped around heads like scarves, around legs like makeshift trousers, around hands like fingerless gloves, often just bits of old fabric tied on with string. In the worst months, people slept in their clothes, not because it was comfortable, but because undressing was an invitation to illness. To own multiple wool garments was to be rich in the ways that mattered when skies turned gray and breath hung in the air like mist. Wealth wasn't gold. It was warmth, a dry tunic in the morning, a cloak that didn't leak, a blanket without holes, and if you were lucky, if you were truly, wildly fortunate, someone in your family knew how to make them, a mother who spun wool by lamplight, an aunt who bartered thread for bread, a grandmother who'd kept a needle hidden since her wedding day, wrapped in cloth at the back of a box, because wool wasn't just fabric. It was memory, inheritance. Lifeline.it held the shape of the wearer even after they were gone, smelled like them, felt like them, and in the deep parts of winter could fool you into thinking they were still near just from the warmth left behind. And that warmth, it was priceless. It moved silently from body to body, season to season, never spoken of, always needed. Wool wore down slowly. It frayed at the cuffs, thinned at the elbows, unraveled at the knees. But people held on to it anyway, because letting it go meant braving the cold without your armor, and no one survived that way, not in the kind of world where warmth was fleeting and the cold never really left. But if you wrapped yourself tightly, if the wind couldn't find your skin, if the fire had just enough life left to warm the edge of your cloak, then you had a fighting chance. And now, wrapped and layered and bundled tight, let's walk outside, where the filth wasn't just filth. It was insulation. Mud was everywhere. It clung to boots, skirts, animals, tools. It lined the edges of paths that were never truly dry. It crept into homes, dried on ankles, flacked off walls. It was not a nuisance. Not really. Not in the way we think of mess now. In the medieval world, mud was simply part of life, like breath, or hunger, or silence, and in winter, when the winds cut sharper than knives and roofs began to groan with snow, mud became something else entirely. It became protection. The walls of peasant homes were not built of stone or brick. They were shaped from wattle and daub-woven wood and packed earth, straw and dung, and yes, mud. It was smeared on thick with bare hands, sun-dried in summer, patched in winter. A mix of the cheapest things, what fell from animals, what rose from the ground, what was left over from something else, and it worked. The thicker the walls, the better they held in heat. The more layers of mud applied, the better the wind was kept out. It cracked and crumbled, yes, but it could be repaired. Watered down, stirred with straw, slapped back on. It was slow, cold work, done in silence, done in prayer, and it was warmer than stone. in the poorest huts, there were no floorboards. The floor was dirt packed down, smoothed over, swept as best it could be. And when the rains came, or the snows melted, or the fire died too early, that floor turned soft dot. It sucked at heels dot. It clung to toes, but it insulated. It trapped warmth. Beneath its surface, kept drafts from crawling through from below. Children played in it. Cows trudged across it. Bread was sometimes dropped into it, dusted off, and eaten anyway. Because dirt wasn't filth. It was familiar. It was everywhere dot in the folds of clothing, behind your fingernails dot in the seams of every single thing you owned. It coated the walls of the hearth. It thickened the straw on the floor. It filled the gaps between roof beams, stuck there with handfuls of hay, and the wish that it might hold just one more winter, and somehow it did. The houses weren't beautiful. Not in the way we think of beauty. But they stood, leaning, sagging, tilting but standing. Their walls steamed when the fire inside was lit. The mud warmed from within. You could feel it if you pressed your palm to the side of the house on. A cold night, just beneath the window cloth where the daub had dried darker. It would be warm to the touch. Not hot. Not glowing. Just warm. Enough. Shoes were wiped at the door, not to keep the inside clean, but to keep it thick. Too much dry mud, and the floor cracked like old bread. Too little, and it softened too much. So families managed it, tended it like any other part of life. They knew when to let it be, when to reapply, when to stomp their boots a little harder so the bits could be swept toward the walls and used again. Mud was never wasted, and outside. In the yard or the path, it thickened in winter until it became something like glue. Animals sank into it. Wagons left deep ruts that didn't smooth out for weeks. But it muffled sound, softened footfalls, made the world a little quieter, and that quiet was welcome, especially at night when you lay in bed and heard the slow drip of melting snow from the roof, or the soft thump of a dropped log, and beneath it all the stillness. Held in place by layers of earth pressed tight against your walls, your feet, your skin dot in those moments. You didn't curse the mud. You thanked it for keeping the wind out, for keeping the warmth in, for clinging, for holding, for staying, even as everything else tried to leave. The rich might have had stone floors and slate roofs, but stone was cold. Slate let in the wind, and their fires burned hotter because they had to. Their homes echoed with cold, but in the homes of the poor, the walls breathed, and what they breathed. In what they exhaled was the warmth of those who lived within. All thanks to mud, not glamorous, not clean, but loyal, and now, warmed by walls that remember every season past, let's turn our eyes toward the youngest among them, who ran barefoot in frost, who laughed in the cold, who found warmth wherever they could and carried it, even in small hands. Children don't remember the cold the way adults do. They remember the sound of frost crunching underfoot, the way their breath came out like little ghosts, the way bare toes pressed into straw, then snow, then back again because they forgot to care. Or maybe they never learned to. Cold was simply the background noise of life, like the distant clatter of pots or the groan of the wooden door when the wind pushed too hard against it. You lived with it, the way you lived with hunger or mud, closer than a sibling, quieter than a prayer. A child's feet were never truly warm. They were red, chapped, lined with dirt. Sometimes they bled. Sometimes they cracked. But rarely did they stop moving because movement made heat. And heat was the game. The fire belonged to the adults. That small, flickering crown in the center of the home tended, protected, whispered too. Children learned quickly not to get too close, not to play too near, not to waste the precious wood that fed it. So they stayed at the edges, danced on. Cold stones, tapped out rhythms in the air to keep their blood moving. Socks were for the rich. Shoes, if they had them, were too big or too small. Passed down, patched up, stuffed with straw or rags. Some were little more than leather wrappings tied with string, darkened by years of weather and wear. Others had holes that let in snow, then slush, then silence. Still, they played dot in the yards, dot in the streets, dot in the barns, if they were lucky enough to have them, games that didn't require toys. Just bones or rocks or knots of rope. They shouted with breath fogging in the air, cheeks pink with cold, fingers stiff but still grabbing, climbing, pointing. And when their feet ached too much, they huddled near animals. Chickens didn't mind a small hand in the feathers. A dog might curl against a leg. A pig's flank could warm even the smallest child's back if approached with care. In the evening, they would be gathered near the hearth. Not too close. The adults came first. But close enough to catch a little warmth if they sat still. That was the trick. Stillness. Stillness meant warmth. Squatting low, hands over knees, feet tucked under thighs. Even the youngest learned how to preserve their own heat. How to let their breath warm their fingers. How to press their feet flat into the dirt, absorbing what little heat still clung to the ground. They shared blankets in sleep. Siblings bundled together like pups. Some nights, they whispered to each. Other beneath layers of wool and straw, making up stories, giving names to shadows, counting the stars they couldn't see but knew were there. On other nights, they didn't speak at all, just breathed together, a chorus of soft inhaling, interrupted only by the pop of a log in the fire or the snore of someone older, already lost to dreams. Illness came quickly in winter, a cough, a shiver, a fever that didn't go away. Children were often the first to fall ill, and sometimes the last to recover. Their feet would grow colder then, even near the fire. Blankets would be tucked tighter. Broth spooned carefully into silent mouths, and still the cold pressed in. Sometimes the warmth of a child's foot was borrowed by a parent's hand, cupping it, rubbing it, whispering gently to it like it could hear. Just stay warm. Just stay alive, because a child's warmth wasn't just comfort. A tea was promised. A tea meant the family would go on, that laughter would return in spring, that someone would still remember the stories of how cold it had been and how. They'd all survived it. Together. So the children with cold feet played and shivered and slept and grew, not despite the cold, but through it. Their bones hardened in winter. Their lungs grew strong in the wind. Their memories clung not to frostbite or pain, but to the moment someone pulled them close and wrapped them in the last spare piece of wool without saying a word, because love, in winter, didn't need words. It needed warmth, and when children found it even briefly, they carried it like a secret, like a spark, like a story too fragile to tell aloud, and when that story faded into sleep, the fire still burned low behind them, and the house exhaled one long breath of quiet survival, which leads us now to the one thing that warmed the body and choked it at the same time, the fire that had no chimney. The fire gave, and it took. It gave heat, light, a center to the room, a place for stories and silence, both. But it also gave something else, something that lingered long after the flames had gone to ash, smoke, thick, bitter, alive. In homes without chimneys, which was most, the smoke had no graceful exit. It wandered. It clung. It filled every hollow in the ceiling, then drifted lower, curling around beams, weaving into wool, finding its way into the soft pink insides of noses and throats. It stung the eyes, made them water in the dark. Children coughed in their sleep. Mothers squinted while stirring porridge. Fathers blinked while tying knots by firelight, and yet no one moved away from it, because smoke meant the fire was alive, and the fire. For all its flaws, was the heart of the home. There was a place in every medieval dwelling where the fire belonged. A shallow stone ring, or just a hollowed place on the floor lined with older ash. The ceiling above it blackened over years, timber. Beams darkened by time, the wood speaking softly as it warmed and cooled again and again. There were no flues, no hoods, no clever vents to guide the smoke outside. So it hung low in winter, too heavy to rise, too stubborn to leave. It moved in slow clouds across the ceiling, then down, drifting toward faces and bowls and hands, sometimes when the wind shifted. Just right, it found its way out through a gap in the thatch. But mostly it stayed. People learned to live beneath it. To breathe shallow. To sit low. To wave it away with hands that were already busy with other things. Clothes smelled of it. Blankets absorbed it. Babies breathed it from the moment they were born. It became part of them, and still, the fire was fed with twigs and branches, with bits of dung dried in the sun, with whatever scrap would catch and burn. However faintly, even wet wood was used, though it spat and hissed and filled the room with more smoke than flame, because heat was needed, even bad heat, even smoky heat, better to cough than to freeze. Sometimes a hole was carved high in the wall or ceiling an eye for the house to breathe through. But wind blew through those too. Rain snuck in. Snowflakes found their way inside. So even that was a trade on the worst nights. The house filled completely, eyes watered constantly. Breathing turned shallow. Some slept sitting up to avoid the worst of it. Others lay flat, hoping the smoke would float above them, but it didn't. Always. It circled. Hovered. Waited. In the morning. Voices were hoarse. Chests felt heavy. And the walls, though they held in the heat, also held in the smoke. Every surface sooty. Every breath tinted. Still, no one blamed the fire, because it had tried. It had burned when it could. It had made the porridge boil and the room glow. It had softened the water for washing and warmed the rock to place in the bed. It had lit the faces of those gathered near it, casting soft gold into their tired eyes. There was comfort in that, a kind of forgiveness, even as lungs burned and ceilings wept with moisture. The fire continued to be fed, because it was all they had. A single candle didn't warm the room. A lantern couldn't bake the bread. Only flame imperfect, smoky, beautiful could do that, and so they lived with it, the way one lives with an old friend who sometimes speaks too loudly or overstays their welcome, with love, with tolerance, with gratitude, even now, when ruins are found. The black on the beams tells the truth. These homes lived and breathed fire. Every family slept in smoke. Every garment held its scent. Every story was told through a haze of flame and fog, and somehow, through it all, they endured, eyes blinking, chests rising, hands outstretched toward warmth that came with a cost, and that cost they paid willingly, because cold was worse, and silence was colder still. Now, as the fire dies low, and the smoke curls like ribbon into the beams above, we turn our gaze downward. To those who shared their sleep not just with kin, but with tiny guests, uninvited, unnoticed, until you felt them move. At first, it was just a sound, a scurry, a shift of straw, the gentle scrape of something small, moving just beyond the fire's glow, then silence again, but not emptiness, because even in the stillest nights, you're never truly alone. The rats came with the cold. Not summoned, not invited, but inevitable. They lived in the walls, beneath. The floor, between the folds of fabric stuffed into drafty cracks. They curled near the fire when no one was watching. They crept across rafters, dropped into corners, vanished into shadow. You didn't scream. You didn't swat. You simply adjusted, because fighting them meant chasing ghosts. And in a home with 3 children, 1 blanket, and a hearth that barely held a flame. Rats were not the worst of your worries. They were a presence. Like the wind, like the cold, like the ache in your back from lying too long on straw. Sometimes they were even useful. They kept the FLIs away in summer. They warned of coming storms with their frantic movements. They ate what might otherwise rot and draw worse pests. But at night, when the fire burned low, and all that remained was breath and body heat, they came closer. You might feel one brush your foot. You might hear one chewing softly near the door. You might open your eyes in the dark and catch the glint of its eye, watching just for a second before it vanished again. Children were taught not to fear them, not out of denial, but out of necessity. Fear was a luxury. So they learned to sleep anyway. To pull blankets tight around their legs. To tuck hands beneath their backs. To place food, if there was any, on a shelf too high for tiny paws. But it didn't always matter. Rats could climb. They could gnaw through wood. They could find their way into even the best sealed boxes. And sometimes the best you could do was acknowledge them, say softly, "Not tonight," and hope they understood. Sometimes they didn't. The morning might bring new chew marks in a cradle, droppings near the flour sack, a half-eaten crust. But life continued. Rats didn't bring ruin. They brought reality, that in this world you shared everything, not just space, not just warmth, but the vulnerability of being alive in a place where even the smallest creature fought to survive the cold. There were cats, of course, but not always, and not every cat could be fed well enough to care. Sometimes the cats slept alongside the rats. Too tired or too thin to chase, what barely made a difference, and the dogs barked only when the rats grew too bold, when a nest was built beneath the hearth or a newborn piglet was nibbled in the barn. But even then, the barking stopped eventually, and the rats stayed. There were superstitions too. Some said they carried souls, that if you whispered to them kindly, they would leave your bread alone, that they listened at night and reported to things that lived deeper than cellars, things older than fire. Others said to never curse a rat aloud, lest it remember and return in the spring. Vengeful and clever. So you learned to speak softly, even to the smallest thief, even to the tiny feet that ran across your dreams, because sleep was more important than anger, and survival more important than comfort. The rats were a reminder that not all intruders come with malice. Some come with hunger. Some come with cold. Some come with the same reasons you wrap yourself in wool and press close to the fire, just to live, just to get through the night. And if they stayed in their corners, if they kept to the shadows, if they took only crumbs, then perhaps, in some strange way, they had earned their place, because in homes where silence was loud, where warmth was rare, and where comfort was never guaranteed, even a rat became part of the story, a scurry, a presence. A tiny, beating heart beneath the same thatched roof. And now, as the fire softens and the floor grows colder beneath you, the hunger comes again, not the rat's hunger, yours, and what it felt like. To work through it, to live beside it, to wear it like a second skin. Hunger didn't always roar. Sometimes it just sat with you, quiet, heavy. Patient. It followed behind, like a shadow. It curled in your belly, soft as a sigh. It whispered in your ears when you bent to work, telling you that maybe, this time, the feeling wouldn't go away. There were no alarms, no schedules for meals. You ate when you could, what you could, and not always enough. Hunger in the medieval world wasn't rare, it was routine, as common as frost, as expected as mud, and somehow you still got up, you still worked, because the fields didn't care if you'd eaten. The cows still needed milking. The wood still needed chopping. The earth still demanded your hands. So you gave them even when they trembled, even when your legs moved slower, your breath came shorter, your back bowed earlier in the day than it had the week before. A tea was a kind of strength that didn't announce. Itself, a quiet endurance.to carry buckets with empty arms.to walk miles with nothing in your stomach. But the memory of porridge.to rise from bed, knowing there would be no bread that morning, but rising anyway. Children learned early how to distract. Hunger, they chewed on bits of bark or straw. They made up songs. They dipped fingers in the leftover drippings of lard and sucked them slowly. Like candy, mothers broke pieces in half before they served them. Fathers pretended they'd already eaten. Older siblings gave up crusts without being asked, because hunger didn't just live in one body. It lived in the home. It filled the silence between conversations. It shaped choices. It slowed time. And yet, the work never stopped. Hollow stomachs still meant heavy hands on plows, on axes, on buckets, on looms you carried more than you had energy for. Because not carrying it meant someone else would have to. Someone older, someone younger, someone weaker. So you carried it. Not just the weight of labor, but the burden of knowing there wasn't enough to go around. But there were small mercies, wild berries in the hedges, nettles in spring, mushrooms that grew near the roots of certain trees if you knew which ones were safe, a rabbit caught in a snare left overnight, a neighbor who had just enough to spare a spoonful and not enough to feel noble about it. Sometimes you fooled your hunger, boiled water with herbs, thicker, stews made from nothing but turnips and memory, bread thinned with ash, with oats, with hope, anything to give the illusion of fullness. And at night, when you lay in bed and your stomach twisted, you held the silence close, because the pain of hunger was less frightening than the sound of someone crying from it. So people learned to suffer quietly. To yawn when they were weak. To smile with dry lips. To say, I'm fine, with the softness of someone who knows they aren't, but knows someone else needs that answer more than the truth. And yet, laughter still happened. It rose like steam from a hot bowl on a rare good day. It fluttered from children playing with their empty hands. It lived in old songs, passed down across the table, sung softly between bites of too thin soup, because even hunger could be softened. Be wise story. Be wise song. Be wise someone sharing their last bite with you. Even if it wasn't enough, there was dignity in that, a kind of wealth that hunger couldn't touch. To still be kind, still be generous, still carry others, even when your own bones felt too light, your thoughts too slow, your legs too soft. The body shrank sometimes, but the soul, oddly, stayed the same size, sometimes even grew. And when the pain faded into numbness, when the emptiness became familiar, when you stopped dreaming about feasts and started dreaming about fires, that's when you knew you had survived another day, not fed, but not finished. And that was enough, because there was still work to be done tomorrow, still mouths to feed, still a world waiting to be touched by heavy hands even when they trembled. And now, those hands reach for something else, not food, but relief, a chance to scratch the itch that never seemed to leave. There was always an itch somewhere just beneath the collar, or between the shoulder blades, or behind the knee where the wool bunched and chafed. You scratched it softly at first, then harder, then with the edge of a wooden spoon when no one was looking. It wasn't imagined. It was everywhere. The wool didn't help, of course. It was thick and coarse, spun from sheep that had never known softness, stiff from the wind, stained from the hearth, worn too long and washed too little. It rubbed and rubbed and rubbed until the skin underneath felt raw from the simple act of wearing it. But wool wasn't the culprit, not really. The real invaders were much smaller, lice, fleas, mites, tiny things that lived in the folds of fabric, in the seams of tunics, in the straw of beds. They moved silently, bred quickly, bit constantly, and no one was spared. Not the child tucked safely under wool blankets, not the elder wrapped in 3 cloaks near the fire. Not the mother who washed with icy water in the stream, hoping to feel clean even if just for an hour. The itch was part of you. You scratched without thinking, while kneading dough, while spinning thread, while kneeling in prayer, one hand always wandering toward the scalp, the neck, the inside of an elbow, and in private, when no one could see, you'd lift the hem of your tunic and scratch until your skin burned. Then you'd stop and go on, because that's what everyone did. There was shame in it at first when you were young, when you didn't understand why your skin felt like it was crawling, when you cried from the bites and the blood and the heat. But then you grew and learned that this too was normal, that even the priest scratched behind his ear, that even the wealthier villagers, those with boots and cloaks and bread, still carried the same silent passengers. Some tried to fight them, boiled clothes, hung tunics in the smoke to kill what lived within, combed their hair with tight wooden teeth, hoping to catch more than just tangles, washed with vinegar when they had it, rubbed garlic on their skin, laid out their blankets in the frost, hoping the cold would chase the creatures out, but they always came back, because the warmth of the human body was irresistible, because firelight, despite all its beauty, made it easier for things to hide in the folds of clothing, and because there were simply too many bodies in too little space, pressed too close for too long, the itch became something you lived with, like the cold, like the hunger, like the silence. Some nights you scratched in your sleep, woke with red lines on your arms, your legs, your ribs. Other times the bites swelled, and you pressed warm cloths against them, or asked a friend to look at your back, to tell you if it was worse than yesterday. And when the days grew warmer, the itch grew louder. Spring brought life back into the world, but also into the nests, the beds, the blankets. That was when people sat outside, pulling apart their mattresses with sticks, shaking out straw, sifting it in the light, letting it breathe. The whole village would hum with the soft rhythm of scratching, like a song no one sang aloud. But everyone knew the tune, and yet there was still beauty in the way mothers scratched their children's scalps with care, inspecting like healers in the way elders laughed at the futility of it all, remembering winters past. Itch has survived. Bites forgotten in the way people still dressed themselves each morning. Knowing full well what awaited them beneath the wool, they did it anyway, because they had to, because there was still work, still ritual, still love. You held someone, even when you knew you'd wake up with their itch tomorrow. You slept in the same bed, even if you'd counted 3 fleas in it last night, because closeness mattered more, and sometimes that closeness soothed more than the scratch ever could. Eventually, the skin calmed, or you stopped noticing, or the frost returned, and the bugs retreated for a season, but they would be back. They always were, and you would greet them as you had before, with a sigh, with a scratch, with the quiet patience of someone who's seen worse, because you had, because in a world of aching bones and silent prayers, the itch behind the wool was just one more thing to endure. And next came the reason why wool mattered so much in the first place. Because outside there was no mercy, and gathering firewood wasn't just a chore. It was a test. There was never enough wood, even in the middle of a forested land, even with trees in view and branches above. Somehow, there was never quite enough. Not for what the cold demanded, not for what the fire devoured each day, not for what the night stole back. Firewood was not a pile beside the hearth, it was a journey. Every morning, someone left the home, wrapped in layers too thin, boots too soft, hands already aching, a woven basket on their back, or just their arms, bracing for the weight they didn't yet have. The forest was not always far, but it felt far, especially in snow, especially with hunger in your belly, especially when your fingers hadn't yet warmed from the night. You didn't cut trees, you gathered branches already fallen, twigs scattered from the wind, bark that could be peeled and dried and coaxed into flame. Sometimes you dragged a log from the edge of a stream, soaked but still promising heat. The rule was simple. Never take what you can't carry back, because returning empty-handed was worse than not going at all. And so, you bent, stooped, sifted through underbrush with bare hands or stiff gloves, looking for what might burn. You didn't think about how cold you were. You couldn't. Because every moment of pause let the cold creep closer to the skin, stiffening joints, dulling thoughts. And cold fingers were dangerous fingers. They dropped wood. They failed to grip. They took too long, and the fire back home didn't wait. Children sometimes went too, small enough to crawl under fallen trees, quick enough to spot the good twigs from the bad. They made games of it at first, counting branches, racing one another, pretending the forest was alive, and they were secret keepers sent to gather from its floor. But even they grew silent when the wind picked up, when the sun didn't rise, when snow came down like a warning. The return was the hardest part, the basket. Heavier, the body colder, the sky darker than before. The wood you carried was your prize, your burden, your warmth for the night. Each step back home was measured by how tightly your fingers could still hold the bundle, how many times you had to stop and breathe through the burn in your hands. By the time you arrived, your legs were damp, your face wind-burned, your hands red, and stiff, trembling from cold or effort, or both. But you smiled, because the fire would live a little longer. The embers, hidden under yesterday's ash, would spark again. And tonight, perhaps, the room would hold a little more warmth. Just enough to thaw feet, just enough to dry wool, just enough to keep silence from settling too deep. And then tomorrow, you'd do it again, because the fire didn't rest. It ate constantly, fed by your effort, your time, your blood. Sometimes it betrayed you, burned too fast, refused to catch, sent smoke curling into your eyes without reward. But you never turned from it, because without it, the night was unbearable, because fingers needed warmth, because breath needed heat, because the quiet around a cold hearth was the kind of silence that made you question things. And so, even when your hands cracked, even when the bark bit your palms, even when frost clung to your sleeves, you always gathered. Even when it wasn't wood, you gathered dry grass, peat, cow dung, whatever could smolder and pretend to be flame, because cold didn't care what you burned, only that you burned something. And at night, when the fire popped and crackled in the hearth, and you stretched out your fingers in front of it, you forgot how much it had cost. Just for a moment, you closed your eyes, let your hands float over the heat, and pretended that warmth was free, that you hadn't walked for it, bled for it, begged the forest for it. Just warmth, alive and flickering, and in that flicker there was peace, brief but real. And now, as the firelight dances across the walls, let us imagine something softer. Not warmth for the body, but warmth for the mind. A small light, a glowing wick, a candle. That kept you company. The flame was small, not roaring, not bold. Just a quiet flicker in the corner of the room, clinging to the end of a thick wick, breathing as slowly as the people around it. A candle wasn't just light, it was presence. In a world where the sun vanished early, where firewood was hoarded like treasure, where darkness filled every corner without apology, a candle felt like a friend. It didn't try to warm the room. It didn't chase the shadows away, but it stayed. It held its glow. It made the space feel less empty. Candles were not lit for luxury. They were rationed, saved, used sparingly, made from tallow, if you were poor animal fat rendered into wax, thick and heavy and yellow. They stank when they burned, let off smoke that clung to the ceiling and settled in the lungs. But they worked, and in that soft cone of light, things changed. A mother could mend, a child could read a carving, or trace their finger along a game scratched into the floor. A man could check the state of his boots, or count the stitches in a fraying tunic. The candle gave enough glow for fingers to move, for eyes to adjust, for thoughts to settle. People sat near it, not close like they would a fire, but near enough to be seen. To feel seen. To remember that they were still here, still alive, still lit from within. Some candles were placed inside glass jars, if glass could be had. Others sat on metal holders, or, more often, bits of clay or carved wood, or even a stone with a hollow pressed into the center. There was no ceremony to its lighting, just a match from the hearth, a held breath, and a moment of silence while it caught. It was never wasted. You didn't light a candle unless you had a reason, unless something needed doing, or unless the night had been too long and you couldn't bear one more hour in the dark. Sometimes it was lit just for company, because silence can grow too loud, because the wind scratching at the walls begins to feel like something else, because someone had died recently, and their absence filled the house like smoke. So you lit it and sat with it and let it burn. Children watched the wax melt, dripping slow, leaving trails down the side. They'd trace those trails with their eyes, over and over, until sleep claimed them. Some whispered secrets to the candle, thought it could carry their thoughts away, that the smoke curling toward the ceiling might find a spirit, or a star, or someone they missed, and maybe it did. And no one ever said it out loud, but they believed it quietly, the way you believe in warmth. In kindness. In things that leave light behind. Candles were stolen sometimes, from markets, from the homes of the dead, from churches even, not out of greed, but out of desperation. Because 1 hour of candlelight could feel like salvation, and when the candle burned low, when the wick stuttered and bent, and the flame began to fade, people watched it like a friend leaving. They didn't try to make it last longer. They simply thanked it and let the room return to dark. But while it lasted, oh, how it changed things. Letters were written by candlelight in shaky script. Prayers whispered over small flames. Lovers kissed in the glow, just once, then pulled apart. Faces studied each other like paintings. Hands found hands. And silence felt less sharp. It wasn't just a candle. It was a moment, a presence, a pause, and when it died, when the wick hissed and vanished into smoke, the room didn't feel abandoned. It felt full, like the light had lingered somehow, like it had left something behind. And maybe it had, because those who sat with candles understood that even the smallest light could offer comfort, could steady breath, could soften fear. And that's what the night required. Not power, not brilliance, just company. Now the candle is out, but something deeper stirs, not in the air, but in the chest. A sound, soft but sharp, a cough in the corner of the room, and suddenly you remember what silence can hide. It always began softly, a cough not loud, not alarming, just a dry little sound in the corner, a breath that didn't finish cleanly, a throat that tried to clear itself in the quiet. Someone would glance up, then down again. No one said anything, because they all knew illness came in whispers. It didn't knock at the door. It crept in through the cracks, rode in on a breeze, settled in the chest like smoke. And once it was there, it didn't leave easily. In winter, the coughs grew more common. They echoed through homes not built for air, where dampness collected. In corners, and sleep came cold and shallow. Beds were crowded, blankets were thin, and one person's breath quickly became everyone's. A child coughed in the dark. A mother laid her hand on their chest, not to stop it, not even to soothe, just to measure it, to feel the rise and fall, to listen for what the silence after the cough would mean. Sometimes it meant nothing, just a scratchy throat, dried by the smoke. Other times, it meant the beginning of a fever, a slow unraveling, a week spent in bed, too weak to eat, too tired to talk. There were no thermometers, no pills, no clinics, just herbs, steam, prayers, and warmth, if you had it, a pot of. Hot broth was medicine. So was sleep. So was the soft hand of someone who stayed nearby, even when there was work to do outside. But not everyone could afford the so the cough continued, while laundry was done, while wood was gathered, while meals were stirred. You learned to live beside it. To ignore it until it changed, and when it did change deeper, wetter, more frequent, you noticed. Then you waited. You waited because there wasn't much else to do. The healer might be days away, might not come at all, even. If they did, they had little more than salves and willow bark. Maybe a cloth soaked in vinegar. Maybe a story about someone who'd survived worse. But sometimes you didn't want stories. You just wanted the coughing to stop. Sometimes the coughing person didn't want to be seen. They pulled their blanket higher, turned their face to the wall, because there was shame in being sick. As if the weakness had invited it. As if being too tired meant you hadn't tried hard enough, and so they suffered quietly, between sips of water, between flickers of firelight, between the lullabies of mice and wind. At night, others lay awake listening to them breathe, counting the gaps between coughs, timing the silence, wondering if they should wake them or let them rest. And when sleep finally came, it was thin and restless, because no one truly slept in a house with a deep cough. It lived in everyone's chest. In their ears. In their worry. Sometimes the cough passed, left as quietly as it came, like a visitor with no belongings, and the household returned to normal. Laughter returned. So did appetite. So did the color in the cheeks. But sometimes it didn't pass. The cough grew heavier. It rattled. It shook. It bent the ribs, and then it stopped, not because it healed, but because the breath beneath it gave out. A death in winter was quieter than in summer. There were no flowers. And no birds, just the scrape of a shovel through half-frozen ground and the sound of cloth being folded. Packed away, the bed was cleared, but the cough stayed in the silence for a while, a reminder that warmth could be a shield, but not a cure, that illness didn't need permission, that the body was fragile even when the spirit was stubborn. And yet, even with that memory, life moved on. It had to, because the fire still needed wood, the animals still needed feeding, the bread still needed baking. So the living kept on living, and the cough, for a time, was replaced by other sounds. The crack of ice melting, the clatter of boots by the door, the soft murmur of someone saying they would have liked this weather today. And beneath all of it, the quiet hum of survival, still breathing, still rising, still going forward. Now, the cough is gone, but another threat waits just above your head. It comes not from the hearth or the earth, but from the sky itself. It didn't start with a storm, just a few flakes, soft, hesitant, drifting down like feathers with nowhere to land. At first, no one noticed. Snow was a familiar guest, frequent, sometimes gentle, sometimes cruel, but always present in the long months when the light left early and the air held its breath. And then the flakes grew heavier, faster. They fell without wind, without hurry. Like a secret being kept by the sky, the roof just thatch, dry and layered, tied tightly with cord, and hope accepted it. At first, snow settled into the reeds, collecting quietly, forming thin blankets, soft and white and deceitful, because it looked light, but it was not. Snow grew heavy when it stayed. It melted and refroze. It packed itself down, pressed deeper into the weave. Water found seams and settled into hollows. The thatch held it until it couldn't, and then the drips began, not all at once. Just one, maybe two. A soft sound, almost ignorable, a dark spot spreading across the ceiling above the bed, a cold splatter onto a blanket, a child blinking awake to a drop on the cheek. The snow had found its way inside. It wasn't a flood. It was worse. It was slow, unstoppable. It came with silence, and it stayed with persistence. You could place a bowl beneath it. Stuff cloth into the hole. Add more reeds from the pile you'd kept near the fire for repairs, but it was never truly fixed, not in winter, not until spring dried everything out again and the thatch could be untied, shaken loose, patched with new bundles. Until then, you lived with it. Snow on the roof was like snow in the soul, cold, quiet, and constant. Some homes tilted inward under its weight. The beams groaned. Nails popped. You could hear the wood shift in the middle of the night, making you wonder if the whole thing might come down in your sleep. And yet, you slept anyway because there was nowhere else to go. Some families built extra layers beneath the thatch. A ceiling of cloth stretched across the beams to catch drips. Animal hides hung overhead to absorb meltwater. A second roof inside the first. It helped. Sometimes other families simply moved their beds, rearranged life to fit the shape of the leak, shifted from one wall to another, shared the driest corner like a gift. People didn't complain, not loudly. They muttered, cursed the storm under their breath. But mostly they adapted. A leak was not a surprise. It was expected. Another task to add to the day, another patch to mend, another reminder that even the roof above you was fighting to survive. Outside, the snow made everything quiet. Inside, it made everything damp. Blankets never fully dried. Boots lined up by the fire steamed endlessly. The straw on the floor clung to the soles of feet, sticky and cold, and still the fire was lit. Still bread was made. Still someone whispered, "It's only winter. It will pass," because it always had. And when the sun finally returned longer and stronger, it melted the snow in great, heavy sighs. It dripped from rooftops, poured from gutters, soaked the ground until it turned to mud. The thatch would breathe again, dry again, and someone would climb up. Legs wrapped in rope, bundle of reeds in hand, to fix what had loosened, what had rotted, what had failed. It was never perfect, but it held, and that was enough, because a roof, even a leaking one, even one pressed low with snow, even one patched a dozen times, was still a roof, still protection, still the line between you and the sky. And sometimes on the coldest nights, when you heard the snow sliding across the thatch, whispering like fabric being folded, you didn't fear it. You listened and felt safe, because above you was something that had been made with hands, woven with care, held together with knowledge passed down quietly. From one cold winter to the next. It had held before. It would hold again, and beneath it, you could close your eyes and let sleep find you, even with snow falling through the cracks, even with the drip beside your pillow, even with the wind pressing in from the north, because sleep didn't wait for spring. It came when it was needed, and tonight it came with the weight of snow and the strength of thatch. But the snow would not always be the worst of it. Sometimes what frightened most was the absence of food. It had been shrinking for days. The loaf, once round, once full, once warm and soft and cracked just slightly on top, now hard, flat, thin as your palm. It sat on the table like a relic, wrapped in a cloth too large for it, as if pretending it was still the same size as before. Everyone had noticed. And no one had spoken, because to name the thing was to give it weight, and hunger already had enough weight of its own. It wasn't a sudden event. There was no drama, no wail. The bread simply ran out. Crumbs on the cloth. A final heel shared between children. The knife wiped clean and put away. Though there was nothing left to cut, that was the day the house grew quieter, not out of sadness. Exactly. Out of calculation. What could be made from less? What could be stretched? What could pass as food if the right words were used? You looked in every place bread might hide dot in the jar at the back of the shelf, in the ashes beneath the hearth, in the folds of someone's apron, just in case they had tucked away a crust for later, but there was nothing. Only the smell of what once was bread had not been just food. It had been the rhythm of life, kneaded into mornings, broken into meals, dipped into broth, packed into pockets, offered to strangers, blessed, burned, believed in, and now it was gone. What came next was instinct: boil water, peel bark, scavenge corners for anything that could hold a shape in a bowl. Some homes turned to porridge thin, barely more than warmth and memory. Others made cakes from acorns or dried weeds, patted flat with trembling fingers, baked on hot stones until they cracked and smoked and pretended to be edible. But it wasn't the same. The body knew, the belly knew, even when the mind said be grateful. Be patient, be brave, the body mourned. Children asked, not with words, but with eyes, is there any more? And their parents smiled, not to lie to protect, because love sometimes means smiling through famine, sharing silence instead of sorrow, turning empty plates into a kind of story. And still, the chores were done, the animals fed first. Always first, because a cow that produced milk was worth more than 100 loaves. Because chickens could still give eggs, even if you didn't eat one today. Because the creatures under your roof didn't understand shortages. They only understood care.so. You cared for them. You boiled pebbles in water, not to eat, but to fill the room with a smell, a sound, a promise. You braided your hunger into your daily labor, one stitch, one sweep, one pile of wood stacked, not thinking of food, not thinking of bread, because what was the point? Bread would come back. It always did, when the snows melted, when the grain ripened, when the oven was warm again, not just from flame, but from purpose. But for now, the days passed. With the taste of absence, neighbors shared what they could. Sometimes it was less than a loaf. Sometimes it was just presence, a knock on the door, a quiet nod. A spoonful of something warm passed from one hand to another without a word, and even that was enough, because in hunger, kindness was a kind of feast. It didn't fill the belly, but it softened the ache, made the day feel less long, the work feel less cruel, the cold less biting. And then, one day, maybe 3 days later, maybe 7, a sound came, a knock, or a shout, or the cry of someone running through the village with a sack held high. Grain, flour, bread is being made again. The oven is lit, and even before you taste it, before you see it, you know. Because you smell it, that unmistakable scent. Brown, burnt, beautiful bread, returning like a miracle, even if it's rougher than before, even if it's smaller, even if it's shared in thinner slices. With more hands reaching, it's here, and when it touches your lips, chewy, dry, perfect, you close your eyes and let the taste erase every hunger that came before. But you remember, you always remember, the day the bread ran out, not as a tragedy, but as a lesson in endurance. In how much the body can bear. In how much the heart can still hold, even when the stomach is empty. And now, with that memory stored like a seed, we rise again, because outside, the frost still waits, and barefoot steps are called for. The floor was colder than expected. Even after all the winters before, even knowing the shape of the cold, the body still flinched when bare feet met the frozen earth. The straw scattered on the ground helped only a little. Just enough to stop the sharpest stones. Not enough to stop the sting, but the barn couldn't wait. It never did. So someone stood slowly, stiffly, wrapped a shawl around their shoulders, stepped into air that bit the face before it even bit the toes. The door was opened quietly, out of habit more than courtesy. No one was sleeping anymore. Not really. And then barefoot to the barn, across the yard, through snow packed hard as stone, past fence posts leaning from frost and years. The sky was still dark. Not night, not yet dawn. That soft in-between time when nothing casts a shadow and everything feels like memory. The barn stood ahead like an old friend. Silent, steady, sagging a little more with each season, but still upright, still holding something sacred inside. Animals, warmth, the rhythm of breath that didn't belong to humans. They didn't greet you. They rarely moved much in the morning. Just twitched an ear, lifted a head, waited, but they were warm. And when you stepped into the barn through that heavy wooden door that stuck in the damp, you were met not by welcome, but by steam, soft and rising, curling from their bodies like breath from tea. The cows were dark shapes in the straw. The pigs slept in piles, slow to stir. Chickens shifted on their perches, half asleep, half alert, murmuring tiny noises like words without meaning. You walked slowly, because the floor was softer here, because the warmth made you dizzy after the cold, because you didn't want to wake them all at once. Your feet began to thaw. A little, the straw was damp, but not frozen. It clung to your toes, stuck to your skin. It smelled of manure and hay and old milk. But it was soft, familiar, kinder than the wind. You knelt by the cows, pressed your hand against a side, broad and warm, listened for the shift of bones, the rumble of belly, the whisper of breath. They smelled like the past, like the beginning of something, like survival. Milk didn't come quickly. It never did. The udder had to be rubbed. The teats pulled gently. The rhythm had to be just right, not too hard, not too fast. You learned it over time. Some days your fingers were too stiff to do it well. Some days the cow wasn't in the mood, but you did it anyway because a bucket of milk meant more than food. A tea meant a warm cup before sleep. A tea meant a child's belly full enough to quiet the worry. It meant something to trade, to share, to use, and for a few minutes, in that dark barn, lit only by breath and routine, the world felt simple, hard, but simple. You spoke to the animals, soft words, not because they understood, but because silence needed breaking. You told them about the wind last night, about the drip in the roof, about the ache in your knees, about how you dreamed of rivers, or bread, or someone you used to know. They didn't answer, but they listened, and that was enough. Then came the pigs, loud when they woke, snorting and snuffling, pushing against each other like spoiled children. Their heat was strong, their smell stronger. You fed them what you could. Scraps, peelings, mash made from boiled roots and dreams. They ate everything. And in their fullness, you found a strange comfort, because they didn't worry about winter. They just lived in it. And finally, you stood again, your feet no longer numb, your arms full milk, eggs if you were lucky, the knowledge that the barn had given again. You stepped out into the cold. A tea greeted you like an old rival. Immediate, sharp, but your body was ready now. You moved faster. The sky lightened. You thought of fire and how the house might smell like smoke and lard when you returned, barefoot to the barn, barefoot back, not because there were no shoes, but because they were saved for longer walks. Because the leather cracked when wet. because the soles had worn thin, because your skin was tougher than you gave it credit for, and because it reminded you. You were still here, still standing, still walking on frozen earth that hadn't claimed you yet. You whispered thanks without meaning to to the animals, to the barn, to the stubborn warmth that waited in unlikely places. And as you reached the house, you looked once more toward the sky. Snow hung there, still falling, but slower now, like it too was tired. Now step inside and close the door behind you. We're not done with winter just yet, because soon the snow will fall thick and deep, and with it, silence. The world didn't go quiet all at once. A tea happened slowly, as if someone was lowering a heavy wool blanket over the landscape, inch by inch. The crunch of footsteps dulled. The wind softened. The voices faded behind shut doors. Until, finally, there was nothing, just snow, falling, thick and slow and certain. A tea didn't scream like rain. It didn't hiss like sleet. It just came soundless, steady, endlessly white. In the medieval village, people noticed the silence first. They looked up from their work, paused in the middle of a chore, held their breath, just to be sure, and there it was, that eerie, perfect hush, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the last person alive. Snowfall had a way of changing the world, not just in color, but in meaning. Paths disappeared. Footsteps were erased. Familiar shapes turned, strange under the weight of white. The same barn, the same fence, the same hills you saw every day now softened, blurred at the edges, as if they belonged to a dream. Children whispered during snowfall, not because they were told to, but because the world whispered back. Even laughter sounded different, even footsteps, even the gentle thump of a log dropped beside the fire seemed to hesitate, not wanting to disturb what the sky had made inside. The silence crept in too, and no one went far in heavy snow. The house grew full. Movement slowed. Voices lowered. People wrapped themselves in whatever warmth they had, not just because of the cold, but because the hush outside asked them to. There was a kind of reverence in it, a stillness that felt sacred. The snow on the roof muffled sound. The windows cloth-covered, frost-rimmed, filtered the light until it fell into the room like a blessing. Candles flickered softly. Wool was mended. In slow, rhythmic gestures, spoons tapped bowls with careful intention. And outside, nothing, just white, falling without hurry, without malice, without end. Some believed the snow carried spirits, that the dead walked silently during snowfall, their feet leaving no trace, their presence marked only by the feeling that someone had just passed behind you. Others believed the snow healed the land, that it covered the old griefs of the earth, let the soil sleep, gave everything below a chance to rest. And no one spoke much during those days. There wasn't much to say. The woodpile was checked. The fire kept alive. Blankets hung over doors. The bread rationed a little thinner, just in case the storm lasted longer than expected. But there was peace in it too, a rare kind, because the world had given you a reason to stop. To sit, to breathe, to listen to the rhythm of snow against the walls, even if you couldn't hear it. To feel it in your chest, in your bones, in the way your fingers moved slower across fabric, and your eyes blinked longer at the fire. Even the animals were quieter. They huddled close, their bodies steaming in the barn. Birds vanished into thickets. Dogs curled beneath blankets, sighing once before sleep took them. And you sat, still, wrapped in wool, wrapped in silence, wrapped in the kind of moment that would vanish the second the sun returned, because it would return. It always did, and with it would come the melt, the drip, the mud, the noise of shovels, the calls to neighbors, the rush to fetch more wood, to tend the animals, to patch the roof. But not yet, not now. Now there was just snow, and the quiet, and your breath, and the soft creak of the fire, reminding you that even in silence, Something still lives. You didn't need to speak. You didn't need to move. You are part of it now, one still figure among thousands. Across time and earth, who have sat just like this watching the snow fall, listening to the hush, and letting the world slow down just long enough to remember what it feels like to be still. But not all quiet was peace. Sometimes the silence. Warned of danger, of fire, of something gone wrong in the very thing meant to keep you alive. A tea was the smell that changed first, not the comforting curl of hearth smoke that clung to your clothes, your blankets, your hair. Not the usual breath of warmth that floated from the fire and wrapped itself around the rafters like a lullaby. No, this smoke was sharper, darker, too strong, too fast. It clawed at your nose, filled the room before the fire had even popped a warning. And that was when your body reacted before your mind caught up. The heart quickened, the breath shortened. Someone stood, someone shouted softly, because when smoke became alarm, you didn't waste time with questions. In homes where fire meant life, it could also mean death. The hearth was always lit, always tended. But fire was never tame. The walls were wood, the roof dried thatch, the beds straw, the floor dust and ash and cloth, a dropped coal, a tipped pot, a wind too sudden through, a door left open. And what once gave you warmth could take your shelter in minutes. There were no fire buckets. And no sand at the ready, just hands, blankets, breath. The first instinct was always to smother. Blankets were thrown over flame. Wood was pulled from the hearth. Scattered, stomped on, water, if nearby, was flung fast and wide. Children were pulled back, doors flung open to let the smoke run free. But sometimes it was too fast. Sometimes the thatch caught, the dry, brittle thatch staring down at the fire all winter long finally let go. And once it burned, there was no saving it. The flames climbed upward like they knew the way, and the people inside had seconds. They grabbed what they could. A pot, a blanket, a child, then ran into the snow, into the night, into the silence shattered now by the roar of flame and the frantic whisper of everything being lost. Neighbors came running, buckets from the well, ropes, hands beating at flame with branches. But the fire didn't listen. It devoured, faster than grief, wilder than wind, and by morning there was only smoke, rising into a gray sky that didn't care, a home blackened, a bed gone, the smell deep and thick and final lingering in hair, in clothes, in dreams. And yet they rebuilt, they always rebuilt, with hands that still stung, with eyes still red, with breath that came sharp from weeping or coughing or both, because fire, despite it all, was still sacred, still needed, still kind on most days. You learned to respect it, to bow to it a little when you passed the hearth. To whisper to it when it flared too high. To never, ever take its patience for granted. Some homes burned and were never rebuilt. The family moved in with neighbors, shared beds, shared silence. The loss sat with them like a quiet third parent, reminding, remembering, asking them to carry the story. Others salvaged what they could, a pan blackened but usable, a lock of hair, a spoon, ashes swept into a corner. Not out of cleanliness, but out of grief, because those ashes held everything, the warmth, the laughter, the small, forgotten moments that lived in the floorboards. Gone now, but remembered, and still. The fire was lit again, somewhere else. In another hearth. By another set of shaking hands, because winter did not care what had been lost. It still came, still asked for smoke, still required flame. So the people gave it, once more. With caution, with reverence, with the same strange love you give a thing that might someday turn on you, but hasn't yet, because warmth was worth the risk, and silence, though safer, was far too cold. Now the flames are steady again. The smoke curls in familiar patterns. The danger has passed, but the water used to fight the fire remains, and it's time to speak of something harder than flame, colder than snow, sharper than silence, water. That had to be touched with bare skin. You didn't wash to feel clean. You washed because someone had to, because the smell of smoke and wool and sweat began to stick like a second skin, because hands covered in soot could not knead bread, because there were times few and far between when the water in the basin no longer held a reflection, only layers of use. So you filled the pot from the well, if it wasn't frozen, from the stream, if you didn't mind your boots sinking, or from snow scooped in baskets, melted slow near the fire, watched like it might run away the moment it turned liquid. The water was always cold. There was no magic trick to warm it beyond what the hearth could offer. No pipes, no pump, no clever copper tub, just a bowl, a cloth, a breath held before the first touch. You began with your hands, always the hands. They worked the most. They cracked, they bled, they hardened. You soaked them, rubbed them gently, tried to remember what they had once felt like before winter took their softness. Then the face, a cloth dipped in cold, wrung out quick, pressed to the cheeks, the forehead, the neck. You gasped each time, no matter how often you did it. Because cold water on warm skin was a kind of shock that never grew familiar. Children hated it. They squirmed, protested, cried, but they submitted, because their mothers sang while they washed, soft, wordless things, not lullabies, just sound. To keep the cold from feeling so sharp. To fill the silence with something round and after the face. The rest, a sponge to the back, a scoop to the chest, a hasty swipe beneath clothing that never fully came off. You didn't disrobe, not fully, not unless it was summer, not unless you're brave. Or very, very dirty. Privacy was rare. So you washed quietly, quickly, modestly, and dried off with whatever wasn't already damp. Sometimes often there was no soap, only ashes, sand, herbs if you had them, and a prayer that the wind didn't blow too hard while you were bare. The worst was the hair. Water poured slow from a jug, hands scrubbed at the scalp. Fingers worked through tangles and straw and days of sweat and sleep. The cold ran down your spine. You clenched your teeth. You shivered, not from fear, but from knowing this was only the beginning. And yet, afterward, something changed, not in the air, but in you. You stood taller. Your skin tingled. Your breath came clearer. You felt lighter, even if the cold still sat in your bones, even if your hands ached from wringing out cloth, even if your feet still bore the marks of frozen ground. You felt new, not clean like nobility might describe it, but clean like the earth after rain, honest, raw, ready to begin again. Clothes were laid near the fire to dry. Hair was wrapped in old linen. Feet were buried back in socks that had only recently lost their damp. And the room smelled different now, of water and herbs, and something like hope, not the loud kind, just the small, stubborn kind that rises when a face is wiped clean, when a child laughs after being dried with a rough towel, when the bowl of dirty water is tossed outside and steams as it hits the frozen ground. Washing in winter was an act of defiance against the cold, against the dirt, against the idea that survival left no room for dignity, because dignity could be found in a warm cloth. In a comb pulled gently through tangled hair. In the soft hum of a mother lifting a child's chin to reach the last spot behind the ear. And so it was done, even when it hurt, even when it shocked, even when the water made your breath catch and your fingers curl, because the chill would pass, but the clean stayed for a little while, now dry again, and dressed again, and warmed by the fire once more. The house falls into quiet again. But this time, the silence is different, more sacred, because prayers are being whispered not out of fear, but out of longing. They weren't written down. The prayers, they came from the mouth in murmurs, from the throat in sighs, from the chest in soft, breath-warmed silence. Prayers for the hearth didn't ask for much, not gold, not peace, not even health, most days, They asked for fire, for warmth that stayed through the night, for wood that burned slow and clean, for flames that didn't vanish when the wind rose or the door opened too wide. In the medieval home, the hearth was not a symbol, it was survival. It sat in the center of the room, the soul of the house. Not grand, not ornate, just a pit, a ring, a low brick lip, if you were lucky. Inside it, a pile of ash always smoking, even in the night. Even when no one was awake to feed it, you didn't let the fire die, because to relight it from nothing was a task meant for brighter days. Stones had to be struck, sparks coaxed from flint, kindling begged to catch, and in winter, when fingers were stiff and wind was cruel, it could take hours. So instead, you prayed, softly, without ceremony. As you knelt to blow on the coals. As you arranged the wood just right, like a puzzle learned by heart. As you pressed your palms together to warm them, and whispered words that had no beginning and no end. Stay with us, keep burning, don't leave us tonight. They were words said under the breath, shared between generations, passed down through hands, not books. Children learned to speak to the fire as if it were a living thing. Are you hungry? Do you want more? Is this enough? They fed it bits of twig, gave it dry straw, fanned it with skirts, and watched it respond first with a glow, then with light, then with that soft, flickering dance that turned darkness into something less frightening. The hearth was a place of stories, of cooking, of sleep, of comfort, but also of memory. Ashes were not swept away too quickly. They were left, because buried inside were the remnants of last week's bread, last night's warmth, the whisper of every word spoken beside it. The fire remembered. It saw who gathered close, who stayed, who came to cry in its glow when loss was too loud for daylight, even in grief. The fire was lit, perhaps especially then. It was something to do, something to tend, something to make the hands move when the heart could not. And when someone died, someone dear, the fire was kept burning long after, not as celebration, but as remembrance, a light to show that warmth could survive even sorrow. Some said embers could carry messages, that if you whispered to the coals, at just the right hour when the night was deepest and no footsteps could be heard, you could send your thoughts to those already gone. So people did, a mother to her mother, a child to a sibling now missing, a wife to a husband who'd gone to war and not returned. The fire took it all. It never answered, but it listened, and that was enough. Hearth prayers were not only for fire. They were for what it represented, a loaf that rose, a baby that didn't cough through the night, a roof that held through the storm, a winter that ended sooner than expected. The fire was asked to protect what the door could not, and it tried as best it could. Flickering, sighing, glowing, sometimes it failed, and the room went dark, and the cold crept in, and then the prayers grew louder, not in volume, but in need. In the way the hands moved faster, the way the eyes refused to cry, because there was no time for tears. Only flame, only hope, only breath, steady and soft, pressed into the ash until it glowed again, and when it did, when the fire returned, even just a little, there was relief, not joy, not celebration, just a quiet thank you, spoken aloud or not at all. And everyone returned to their places, wrapped in blankets, mouths closed, hearts steadier, because the hearth had stayed with them again. One more night, one more prayer answered, and as sleep took hold again, and the logs gave one final pop in the darkness, the house felt full, not of things, but of presence, of a warmth not measured in degrees but in devotion. Now we come to the last breath of night, the final ember, and what happens when even it begins to fade.